Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Social Innovation Think Tank, where we discuss the latest ideas and thinking in social innovation. My name is Paul Tracey and I'm Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the Cambridge Business School and the Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. And we have here as well my co-host Neil Stott, who is also a Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation and who leads the Master's Programme in Social Innovation that we run at the school. So I'm delighted to welcome our guests today, who are Dr. Eella Henry and Dr. Bettina Schneider. I'll briefly introduce them to you. Eella is Associate Professor and Director of Maori Development at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. Ella's research is focused on entrepreneurship, leadership and decision-making from a Maori perspective, and she also has a particular interest in housing and is expert in Maori Indigenous research methodology and methods. Bettina is Associate Dean of Community Research and Graduate Studies at the First Nations University of Canada, where she's also an Associate Professor in Business and Public Administration. Her research is focused on Indigenous community and economic development, Indigenous entrepreneurship, Native critical theory and feminist theory. And we've invited them to speak with us today about social innovation in Indigenous communities, or Indigenous Social Innovation, which is a very important topic about which there is currently a lot of debate and interest. And so before I hand over to Neil to lead the questions, I would just like to ask both of you if you could please give us a very brief overview of your work, and in particular, the research interest that you have. That would be great if we could start off with you, Eella.
First, greetings in my language, kia ora, which means be well. So my particular area of interest in the business school at Auckland University of Technology focuses on enhancing Maori knowledge, working with Maori staff and Maori students to improve opportunities for them. So that's the Maori advancement role. But my research interest, I think, I could encapsulate by saying has been for the last 25 years focused entirely on my people, my culture, my language, and the revitalization of that culture and language and how we incorporate that traditional knowledge into contemporary practice.
Thank you very much. Bettina?
Thank you. So I'd say that well, just to introduce myself, I am non-Indigenous. I have been here at First Nations University for almost 13 years now, and my research has really focused in on Indigenous community and economic strategies, particularly looking at Indigenous financial institutions. That's what first led me to Saskatchewan here, and eventually led me to First Nations University. I began with that, and then certainly have focused a lot on Indigenous relevant business curriculum and financial literacy. That's been a recent topic that I've been working on for quite some time. And then I also have been working a lot in the area of Indigenous social entrepreneurship and also recently Indigenous research methodologies.
Thank you very much. Neil?
Yeah, thank you. So could you tell us a bit about what you feel is or are Indigenous perspectives on social innovation? Perhaps Eella, you can start.
Okay, so I can't and would not speak on behalf of all of the Indigenous peoples of the world. There's, nearly 500 million of us and hundreds of different Indigenous cultures. But from a Maori perspective, Indigenous Maori social innovation for me is very much not so much around finding the new, but reinvigorating the ancient. Our culture, part of the Polynesian diaspora, has lived in the Pacific for 3,000 years, and we've had a relatively stable culture and philosophy that's underpinned our survival and our travels across the Pacific over the last 3,000 years. So there's some good stuff in there. Unfortunately, the colonial experience has done much to either expropriate or undermine that knowledge. And so social innovation for us is about finding those cultural values and philosophy that helped keep our society robust for thousands of years, and working out how we can incorporate those values and practices into contemporary, as I said, into contemporary practice, particularly around leadership, economic development. You know, we were colonized by Christianity, patriarchy, and a very Eurocentric approach to capitalism, which completely undermined our traditional value system and our traditional political economy, which had worked for us for thousands of years. So we're trying to work out, how do we incorporate that traditional community-based economy of affection into a contemporary capitalist environment in a way that maintains our cultural integrity. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Before I move on, you said economy of
Affection.
affection.
So Morse, I think, was the French philosopher, talked about gift giving as an economy of reciprocity. And so we measure the wealth of a person not by what they own, but by what they give away, and how we are affected by our environment, and we are a part of it and intrinsically connected to it. So a mountain is not something to be conquered. A mountain is an ancestor. Therefore, your economy is built around how you maintain the well-being of the physical environment as well as each other, whilst also having a sustainable living.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to that in a little while. Bettina.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Eella just shared. And I just, to add to that, I would say that social innovation, you know, when we're talking about Indigenous perspectives, worldview, peoples, is very much about performing something different, performing new norms and value systems that subvert those dominant paradigms, right? And that really assert Indigenous value systems and priorities. And so, you know, it was so much of my work has focused on Indigenous financial institutions. I work at an Indigenous controlled post-secondary educational institution, First Nations University of Canada. I believe very much in Indigenous controlled institutions and sovereignty and self-determination. The sovereignty and self-determination that comes from these institutions. And so I see so much of that social innovation coming from those institutions, from the communities that we work with. And so for me, it's very much about, you know, the different norms and value systems that are being asserted right through these new innovative spaces that are being created.
So for you, I mean, obviously you're not speaking for all communities, but for you, what are the key features of Indigenous community and economic development in your context, Eella?
Well, I mean, to answer that question, I guess I have to go back a little into our history. You know, less than 200 years ago, when we signed the treaty in 1840 with the British Crown, Maori had complete and absolute economic and political sovereignty over our nation, which has been lost. So much of the efforts of economic and community development have been around, as Bettina said, finding strategies that will enhance self-determination. And it's very difficult to explain to people from other cultures who've not lost their sovereignty what it is like. But we share that experience, you know, with the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, the Basque, the Sapmi, the Inuit. So this is not unique to the Maori world, but community and economic development for those of us engaged in this realm has really been about rebuilding our communities, but doing so in a way that is culturally authentic, that enhances opportunities for collective leadership and self-determination and economy founded on culturally authentic paradigms. So it begins first by accepting the intrinsic value of Maori culture and philosophy and what that brings to business, to entrepreneurship, to innovation, to economic development, and to community development. So the two are woven together as part of the cultural and linguistic revitalization agenda that has driven much of Maori's scholarship over the last 30 years. So to some degree, we those of us engaged in this scholarly endeavor also see ourselves as I've said, paradigm warriors, but not in the aggressive warlike notion of being a warrior, but in the within the concept of wanting to break down the barriers that our people face. And if you look at New Zealand statistics, you will see that Maori feature predominantly in some of the worst and most harrowing statistics. So we have work to do on the ground, as well as the highest levels of scholarly thought and conceptual thinking. And the work on the ground has to be around rebuilding community predicated on traditional values and philosophies and beliefs.
Thank you. Bettina?
So Eella stated it very well. To be able to add to that, I'd say that, well, actually, can I ask you to rephrase, just repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm answering.
Yeah, the key features of Indigenous and economic development in your context. What are the key features?
So I would say the key features, and I've spoken to a couple of them in my previous response, would certainly be self-determination and sovereignty, right? And absolutely institution building, strong institutions that are indigenous, controlled by Indigenous peoples and communities are critical. And certainly, the focus on community itself, right? And it's certainly about building community, rebuilding, as Eella had said, and rebuilding communities, rebuilding nations. And so that's, I don't have much to add, but those are the what I would say the key pieces I see in my work.
I saw a presentation, I think it's by, is it Rick Colburn, is that correct, his name? A couple of years ago, where he put up a slide, and it was a slide I would use for explaining community development and community economic development, but he added the spiritual and the cultural angle as well, which brings in a whole new set of factors, which I think, Eella, you talked to when you talked about a mountain is not something to mine and exploit, it's something to treasure and to think about in a very different way. That seems to me to underpin a lot of your work and a lot of work of your colleagues as activists. Am I correct in thinking that?
Absolutely, and there's a tribe in our country who are the people of one of the longest rivers in the country, and their central cultural identity statement is "I am the river, and the river is me." And if you truly think like that, if you truly believe that that is a fundamental part of your identity, then you're going to treat that river in a completely different way to a culture that would see it merely as a highway or a potential outlet for sewage, or something that can be exploited, used up, polluted, capitalized. So it is a fundamental shift in how we exist in the world, but it has worked for Indigenous cultures for thousands of years, so it has some gravitas, and the trick, and because I'm not being anti-capitalist or anti-modernist, but the reality is the most sustainable cultures of the future are going to be founded on how we live with our environment, given that our current environment is in such a parlous state, and we may well be the last generation of humanity to enjoy the luxuries and privileges we have, because our planet is literally, as the fabulous young Greta Thunberg said, our house is on fire. And Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous thinking, I think, has a contribution to make to social innovation and future thinking about our relationship with that environment, and more importantly, our relationship with each other, because, you know, traditional Indigenous culture is founded for, I've found these commonalities on connection, reciprocity, and a sense of guardianship of our physical, metaphysical, and spiritual capacity. And how we build that into policy and thinking and education and ontology and pedagogy is part of the challenge for Indigenous scholars.
I mean, you talked about you know, the struggle to improve conditions amongst your community, and, you know, connect and improve life chances. I mean, if you think about in reverse, you know, in other communities which are more fragmented, more driven by other needs and less thinking about the environment, ecological, etc. You know, there's a different set of problems, but they connect somewhere. Many communities have to reconnect with things that are lost, as well as coming the other way, like you're talking about. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at our social indicators, the numbers of Maori suffering physical and mental health, the breakdown of families, domestic violence, substance abuse, these are all, for me, variables associated with domestic abuse. You know, so too many of our people have not only been trapped by poverty, but also poverty of the mind, and so the cultural revitalization strategy has to be first and foremost, how do we rebuild that innate sense of strength and resilience that is a part of our traditional culture, and how do we factor that in to future development? And so it's a life's work, but it's, you know, I come from a family where my parents worked in factories. I have the great privilege to work in an institution where I get paid by the word. I have the privilege of financial security. I have the great privilege of having a job that I'm passionate about and love. So the revitalization agenda is what I want to be able to find ways to share with many, many more of my people.
Thank you. So, starting with Bettina this time, so what in your view does an Indigenous perspective bring to teaching and research? Not just in your context, but perhaps broader, you know, to the rest of us.
Absolutely. Well, certainly I'd like to begin maybe with my context and then expand to the broader context. You know, I work at an institution that is here to, you know, to serve First Nations and Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous students, and we absolutely emphasize the importance of bringing in Indigenous perspectives, worldview, content into all of our courses. And I think that it's critical. A friend of mine once said, certainly, you know, students, they need to be able to see themselves in what is being taught. And that's so much of what we try to do in our classes, right, is to make this content relevant to our students and where they're coming from. And so you know, from a teaching perspective, that is one absolute value, right, of bringing in so much of the Indigenous content that we do in our courses. But beyond that, it's absolutely critical for non-Indigenous students to be exposed to Indigenous worldview and all of the incredible perspectives that come with that, you know, with those worldviews. And so we have a number of non-Indigenous students we teach here through First Nations University, and it's, I think, life-changing for many. For me, it was. I am a non-Indigenous person, as I noted in the beginning. I pursued my PhD at UC Davis in Native American Studies, and I first found my way to Native American Studies through my master's in community development. And for me, it spoke to my heart, it spoke to my soul. And there was a perspective, a value system that for me, it hit home. And I think for a lot of our students, as Eella stated earlier, right, it provides a pathway forward, a way of living that I think makes sense for many of us, right? That provides a guide for us going forward in this world that is at times very, very troubled and chaotic. And so I think, from a teaching perspective, there's so much that it offers, but certainly, from a research perspective too, it changes everything. As I said in a presentation that Eella and I were doing just not long ago, for me, I think one of the pieces that is most important to me from a research perspective is the focus in Indigenous research methodologies on action over words, right? Doing, and also on, as Eella mentioned too, reciprocity, relational accountability. That we're not in the research. We shouldn't be in the research for ourselves. We shouldn't be in the research for our academic CVs. We shouldn't be in the research for our egos, and unfortunately that's a lot of what you see out there in the academic world. It's about serving community. It's about community driven research, from my perspective, and it's about respecting and reciprocating, right, with the work you do, and respecting communities and letting them guide the researchers in terms of what they need. And so that's just one piece. I could go on, but I'll just stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Eella, your thoughts?
So I made some notes because I think this is, for me, a really fundamental part of my work, and that is around acknowledging Maori Indigenous Ontology, the philosophy that is the overarching principle that guides epistemology and methodology, and that is true also of teaching, that we develop a pedagogy. All of those ontological and pedagogical issues are intrinsically woven into our cultural value system and ethics. So using Indigenous Maori methodology, we would be philosophically and intellectually incapable of conducting research like the Milgram stuff and the Hawthorne stuff and the Tuskegee stuff, because they're all about exploiting knowledge and removing knowledge from participants. For Maori, research is for, with, and by Maori that delivers empowering outcomes for our Maori world and culture. However, having said that, our, and as we call them in the Academy of Management caucus, our allies and collaborators like Bettina are welcome into that world, because they come with open heart and they acknowledge that our knowledge systems not only enhance our intellectual capital, but also our cultural and spiritual capital. And I don't mean that in terms of religiosity, but spiritual capital is quite literally the soul food that enriches you when you participate in our culture and our knowledge systems. And I need to mention, I had the honor of visiting your university, Bettina, a number of years ago, and it is a physically beautiful environment. It is constructed, and this is why building is something that interests me, it is constructed along lines of traditional value systems. It captures the culture and the identity in the physical landscape, and that's what we Indigenous people, I think, bring to ontology and pedagogy, is the weaving of traditional knowledge into contemporary practice.
Paul?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, on the points about Indigenous methodology and methods and ontology, I'm interested in knowing how non-Indigenous people, researchers like ourselves, can engage with these ideas and use this in our work. How can we access this knowledge?
Do you want me to talk to that?
Yeah, let's Eella.
Sorry. Well, I think the relationship between Bettina and I is an example of that we both realize we are servants of knowledge and science, as we are servants of our communities, our peoples, and their agenda for self-determination and political, economic, cultural revitalization. And we welcome non-Indigenous people into that world if they come with open hearts, and if they come to walk alongside us, not to walk in front and tell us what is civilization, or walk behind us and prod us along a pathway determined by them, but who are our partners, our allies and collaborators. And I very much value that part of the international academy, because we find each other and we work together, and great things happen, and they are things that fill your heart. It's wonderful to be able to do research and deliver it back to your people, and it actually feeds your heart and your soul.
Thank you. Bettina?
Yeah, thank you, Eella. That was very well stated, and I appreciate what Eella did just share. I think for me, I think non-Indigenous researchers, as Eella had mentioned, have to come in with an open heart. They have to come in with an open mind as well to the whole concept of decolonization and what that means. And that is the biggest, that is the first part of the journey. I don't believe you can really move forward in a good way if you haven't gone through that as a researcher, a non-Indigenous researcher. You have to look at decolonization and what that means, and it means so much, right? And it's not a course, it's not a workshop. It's a whole fundamental change in your perspective, in how you relate to others, to the research itself. And so that is I think kind of the first key step. And I know Linda Teehee Smith has done so much to further that whole perspective and narrative and discourse. And so that to me is the kind of first major hurdle. And then I think, there's so much learning to be done on what, what are, the values, the worldviews, the cultural protocols of the communities that you're working with. Again, it's about, for me, very much, it's about community-driven research, right? I'm not driving the research, right? The Indigenous communities that I work with are driving it. The Indigenous organizations, the peoples, they are there to tell me and others what it is what they need and what they want, and certainly it's about that building a knowledge system that is not it's collectively, it's for the collective, it's for the greater good, right? And I think that's, to me, one of the critical one of the fundamental principles of Indigenous research methodology is that the pursuit of knowledge for the community itself, right? And for what that means, which is certainly benefiting the community and the research participants that you're working with. So I hope that.
Well, absolutely, and that's surely a lesson that can apply to all types of research and researchers, especially in the business school community. I mean, now obviously the academy, business schools, there can be quite a conservative set of institutions. And I'm interested to know in how open or receptive you think people are to these ideas. And I'm thinking, for example, Eella, I was reading recently your paper on human relations and collective leadership, offering a Maori perspective on collective leadership, which is very interesting and sort of reconceptualizing in a quite fundamental way, I think, how we understand traditionally collective leadership. But I'm interested in, how that paper was received in the review process. For example, how did the reviewers and others, since it's been published, how have they responded to that work?
Well, the most important recipients, I guess, of the research were our Maori leadership community. And I, thank you for bringing the decolonization word into the context, Bettina, because many of us in the Maori world have spent a lot of time deconstructing the colonization of our own minds. And in part, that was reinforced by notions of hierarchical leadership. I mean, we signed a treaty with the British Crown in 1840 when, the hierarchy of leadership became the norm that was incorporated and inculcated. But actually, collective leadership was the model of traditional, there was no central hierarchy of leadership. You were an expert in a field, so therefore you were a leader in that field. And a lot of that traditional wisdom was lost as part of the colonial process, and how we bring that back and incorporate that. Because, at the end of the day, triangles of power don't work for anybody except the person at the top of the triangle. So there's a vested interest in maintaining the triangle if you happen to have the control of the hegemony that says this is the right way to run a society and a country. And if you come along and challenge that, you are trying to decolonize the notion of power, which means that those who hold the power who don't want to give it up, who don't want to share it, you have to challenge that. So the notion of reinvigorating collective leadership amongst our own Maori and tribal leadership has been fundamental and been overwhelmingly well received, I do have to say, primarily by our women leaders. I mean, we were colonized by patriarchy, and overnight our blokes became the arbiters of power and left us women folk behind. So if you actually start looking at the Maori organizations and communities that are doing well, you will find very strong women. So that's me putting a plug in for the contribution that Maori and Indigenous women around the world are making to cultural revitalization and economic development and social innovation. Because, and I don't know the reason why, it may be biological, it may be genetic, but I do think that traditional Indigenous society was founded on that gender complementarity, which you don't find in patriarchal society, but which is actually, I think, much more sustainable long term. So I'm sorry I digressed a little bit to put in a plug for Indigenous women, but I do feel we are an important part of the change process and the solutions.
So to Paul's point about your reviewers and the academic process, how was it received? And
extremely well. I mean, we've what was more important, and it was an academic paper, is we also wanted to convert that knowledge into what we're calling a working paper, because the alternative to an academic paper is a non-academic paper, which I hate the term, but a practitioner paper that looked at some very practical strategies that we gleaned from the research that can be incorporated and used, and we're delivering those through workshops and sessions with Maori students, Maori graduates and Maori leaders wherever we're invited. And for me, that's the most important outcome for researchers, that it has resonance for our communities. As Bettina said, it's research for, with and by our communities to empower them.
So what do you feel that, students who are not from Indigenous communities, which in our case are most of the students, not all, but most, what could they learn from the Indigenous experience you've been telling us about this evening? What can they learn? What difference would it make to their thought processes, to their research, to their life?
One of the things I highlighted in our presentation at the Academy was how Eurocentric thinking and culture has been very much driven by, over the last 400 years, by a kind of logico-rational objectivist approach to knowledge and knowledge creation. But the reality is, all cultures around the world, when they are exposed to and validate their own cultural identity, are uplifted by it. So non-Indigenous people who come into Indigenous classrooms, Indigenous settings and Indigenous communities, I think, are able to reconnect with their own true, authentic culture and resonate with the spiritual dimension of Indigenous philosophy and thinking. And that is good for all people, because so much of the modernist, world has been about disconnecting us from each other, from our physical and spiritual environment. And the people who come into our world who experience that go away going, oh my gosh, this is a thing. It's a good thing, and I want some more of it, and I want to be part of it, and because it actually fills my heart and my mind and my soul. And if you can get that kind of nurturing from your work, it makes so much of the other stuff we do administrivia. And so I applaud those who want to come into our world with open hearts, those who want to share the journey, those who want to expand the journey, founded on those same principles of connectivity and reciprocity.
Thank you. Paul?
It seems, thinking about what you've both been talking about, that Indigenous social innovation actually has much in common with social innovation in other places around the world, and there's a real complementarity of ideas and thinking, and that social innovation as a concept actually encapsulates very nicely a lot of the work that you've been doing. I'm interested, is there any pushback at all about the idea that social innovation is perhaps a Western concept? Some people have even said it's a neo-colonial concept. And so I wonder that while, I think I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think many of our viewers will see the links between the types of social innovation you're talking about and social innovation elsewhere, is there some of that pushback about the embracing the concept itself within Indigenous communities? Eella, do you want to take that?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, well, look, any use of the English language is always going to have some kind of Eurocentric foundation, which in part is why the linguistic revitalization is important for Māori people. So the notion of social innovation in the English language is translated in our language into much more philosophically resonant notions of kaupapa Māori, which is the Māori agenda. So doing things according to a Māori way is a form of social innovation in a world that has undervalued that Māori way for much of the last 150 years. So yes, you could be accused of using terms even like entrepreneurship as a Eurocentric idea. It's what we as Indigenous scholars have done to those words to decolonize them and to make them resonate for us that is more important than the most clinical definition of the terms. I know that's a roundabout way of answering the question, but I am an advocate of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise and social innovation because for me, they are simply English terms that explain traditional Māori culture.
Good, thank you. What about you, Bettina? How do you navigate that tension?
Well, certainly, I appreciate what Eella just shared because, as she noted, right, that anything coming from the English language or the Western framework, right? It can bring up absolutely tensions and it might be different than how it would be phrased and how it would be viewed, perhaps, right, in many Indigenous communities. But I think there's a lot of Indigenous communities embracing this notion of social innovation, and they're doing so on their own terms and from their own frameworks. I guess that's really what I want to hit on and just reiterate what Eella just said, because it's about it's not necessarily the communities certainly that I work with, that I'm a part of. I see them doing this on their own terms and from their own, it's driven by their own values, their own priorities. That's what it's about. And so the social innovation piece is about challenging systemic social and economic and environmental issues, right? It's about challenging that and creating the space for something different, for something new that is rooted in Indigenous values, priorities, worldview, right? And it's about creating this whole new space to grow and change the narrative, change the discourse, change the the norms that have been, you know, established often by these dominant paradigms, these, you know, systemic challenges. So
might we even say that social innovation could be some kind of bridge or umbrella concept that encapsulates or makes the connection between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems? Could we think about it like that? Or am I getting carried away here?
No, I couldn't agree more. When we are able to work cooperatively and collaboratively, we do create new knowledge and new systems, but the non-Indigenous and Indigenous world coming together in a true partnership actually does, I think, create research outcomes and outputs that serve both of our communities. We only have to look at how some of the cultures around the world are coping with the pandemic to realize that sense of disconnection and dislocation is not serving many cultures. And those that are able to work collaboratively, and I'm, you know, proud to be part of a team of 5 million in New Zealand, are showing that makes us more resilient, and it makes us stronger as a culture, a society, and a people.
I think it needs to be the final question, or we maybe be talking all night. But it strikes me a lot of Paul Knights' work is around place and is around community, and a lot of the issues we've been talking about resonate with the debates around reconnecting with place, which means reconnecting with the environment and reconnecting with community in the sense of, you know, the people who live in place. So a lot of what you talk about really resonates with me with that work, which is basically about disconnect and disempowerment, and often, I think, was it Rob Nixon described as the slow violence of industrialization, deindustrialization, etc., etc. A lot of places around the world, many Indigenous, but many not, are experiencing the same tensions and trying to find solutions that meet their needs. So I do think there's a lot of cross-fertilization in this work. Anyway, so any final words?
I'd just like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and a wider audience. Our planet, our mother, the earth, faces some serious challenges at this time. Humanity faces some challenges. And I think that emotional and intellectual and spiritual well-being are going to be such an important part of the social innovations of the future and the societies that we create as a consequence of this dark and terrible time. So I just want to say thank you, and I wish you and everyone who ambles into this conversation all the very, very best during these strange and troubled times.
Thank you. Bettina?
Yes, I just reiterate what Eella said. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to have this conversation and to share our experiences, our work, and to have this conversation with the both of you, and just you know, the work that you guys are doing through the center is it's incredible, and you know, we really appreciate being part of this. So I wish you guys all the best, and thank you.
Thank you, and hopefully this is the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. But thank you very much for joining us this evening. And we'll see you again.